Have you ever walked into a room and felt invisible? Not because no one looked at you, but because all the attention flowed toward someone else. That was Sophie Bennett's life for as long as she could remember. She wasn't unloved, not exactly. But when you grow up in a family where one child shines so brightly, the other often fades into the background. Sophie learned early what it meant to live in the shadow of her older sister Rachel, the girl who seemed to collect applause with every step she took. Sophie grew up in Boston in a modest house with creaky floors and family dinners, filled with stories of Rachel's latest achievements. Her parents, Linda and Charles, never meant to hurt her, but their pride in Rachel's perfect grades and flawless performances left little room for Sophie's quiet victories. Sophie loved art. She would sit by her window sketching harbors' faces in colors that seemed to breathe life. Sometimes she won small prizes, and for a moment she hoped her parents would notice. But every celebration ended with the same words, "Rachel has done it again." When you're the child who doesn't sparkle as brightly, you start believing that being overlooked is normal. Sophie adored Rachel truly. Her sister's charm lit up every room, and Sophie clapped the loudest. But admiration doesn't erase the ache of being unseen. As years passed, Sophie built a private world inside her sketchbooks, a place where her voice mattered, even if no one else listened. The irony was that her art spoke louder than words, yet at home silence always won. Each drawing became a whisper, a reminder of the feelings she couldn't say out loud. Many families don't realize how deep these small wounds can cut. Parents often believe that praising one child doesn't mean they love the other any less. But for Sophie, it created a quiet weight she carried into every conversation. Teachers noticed her talent, friends admired her drawings, yet none of it seemed to matter at the dinner table. What Rachel achieved was considered extraordinary. What Sophie achieved was simply expected, easily forgotten. The contrast shaped the way Sophie saw herself, important to others, but invisible to the people she longed to impress the most. Think about it, maybe you've lived this in your own way. Maybe you were the younger sibling who worked twice as hard to earn half the recognition. Or perhaps you were the one compared to cousins, classmates, or neighbors who always seemed to do better. This is a silent struggle. So many carry the feeling that no matter how much you give it, will never be enough. Sophie didn't complain, but the ache followed her like a shadow she couldn't escape. A shadow that grew taller as Rachel's light burned brighter. Still, Sophie held on to hope. She believed that one day her parents would look at her paintings and see not just Rachel's sister, but Sophie, an artist with her own spark. Until then, she kept drawing. She drew the Boston harbor at sunset, the faces of strangers on the train, and her own reflection in the mirror. Each line, each color was her way of reminding herself, I exist, even if they don't see me. She didn't know it yet, but those drawings would become her voice, and one day her way of stepping out of the shadows. When Sophie Bennett graduated from college, she packed her life into 2 suitcases and boarded a train to Chicago. It wasn't just about chasing a job. It was about building a life where she could finally breathe on her own terms. The city felt alive, skyscrapers rising above her trains, rattling overhead streets, buzzing with opportunity. She rented a tiny studio apartment, its paint chipped and floors uneven, but to Sophie, it was freedom. For the first time, she wasn't Rachel's sister. She was simply Sophie, an artist with a chance to shape her own world. Her first job in graphic design was modest, designing flyers for small local shops. But every project felt like a victory. Clients praised her creativity, some even returned with bigger requests. Slowly, she built a reputation. Sophie hung her sketches on the apartment walls, turned late-night coffee into fuel, and celebrated small wins with friends who saw her worth. Chicago gave her what Boston never did, a stage where her voice mattered. She began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could step out of the shadows for good. Yet every trip home reminded her of the truth she couldn't escape. At family dinners, Rachel's achievements still filled the conversation, while Sophie's milestones were politely acknowledged before the subject shifted. When Sophie mentioned a new contract or a gallery project, her mother would smile briefly before asking, "Have you seen Rachel's latest campaign?" It was as if Sophie lived 2 lives, one where she thrived and one where she shrank back into the quiet dreamer no one quite noticed. The contrast left her torn between pride and frustration. This experience isn't unique. Many who leave home to start fresh feel the same tug of dual identity. In their new city, they're professionals, creators, leaders. Back home, they're still the kid who never quite measured up. It's a painful dissonance, a reminder that success outside doesn't always heal the wounds inside. Sophie tried to ignore it, burying herself in work. But deep down, she longed for recognition, not just from clients or colleagues, but from the family who had shaped her, even in neglect. That longing weighed on her more than she admitted. The lesson Sophie slowly learned was simple yet powerful validation from others. Even family cannot define your worth. She realized that her art had value because it spoke truth, not because it earned applause. The friends she made, the clients who trusted her, the independence she built, these were not small things. They were the bricks of a life she had chosen, a life separate from Rachel's glow. And though her family couldn't always see it, Sophie began to understand that her worth wasn't up for debate. Still, despite all she had achieved, Sophie carried a quiet hope. Perhaps one day her family would see her not as Rachel's shadow, but as Sophie the artist, the woman, the daughter who had carved her own path. That hope, fragile as it was, led her to board another plane months later. This time, her journey wasn't for work or adventure, but for Rachel's engagement dinner in Amsterdam. Sophie told herself she was going to celebrate her sister. Deep inside, she also longed for a seat at the family table where she truly belonged. When Sophie stepped off the plane in Amsterdam, she carried more than her suitcase. She carried hope. Hope that this time, surrounded by canals and candlelight, her family might finally see her. The engagement dinner was held in a sleek restaurant with polished wood-warm lamps and a view of the city's shimmering waters. Sophie had splurged on a deep emerald dress, a gift bottle of champagne tucked under her arm. She rehearsed smiles in the mirror of her hotel room, telling herself this evening would be different. This time, she would belong. Rachel greeted her with a quick hug, her diamond ring catching the light, before floating off to entertain guests. David, the groom-to-be, was charming in that effortless European way, laughing with Sophie's parents, as if he had been part of the family for years. The long table stretched like a stage, everyone leaning in to hear Rachel's plans for New York venues and designer gowns. Sophie took her seat quietly, adjusting the hem of her dress, waiting for a chance to join the conversation. Yet every time she spoke, her words seemed to dissolve into the hum of excitement. At one point, Sophie mentioned a new design project she was proud of. But before she could finish, her mother leaned across the table, smiling at Rachel, and said, "Show us the sketches of your wedding invitations." The conversation shifted instantly. Laughter and admiration swirled around Rachel once again, leaving Sophie's words unfinished, drifting into silence. It was a moment that stung not because of its sharpness, but because of its familiarity. She had flown across an ocean only to land in the same invisible chair she had known since childhood. This happens more often than we realize. In many families, celebrations become stages for comparison, not connection. A graduation, a wedding, even a holiday dinner can turn into contests of who shines brightest. For those left in the shadows, it can feel like an erasure of their identity. Sophie wasn't jealous, she loved Rachel. But love doesn't cancel pain. Sitting at that table, Sophie realized that sometimes the deepest wounds are carved not by cruelty, but by neglect. The silence after your words can hurt more than any harsh criticism ever could. The lesson hidden in that evening was sobering. Sophie learned that trying to prove your worth in the wrong room will only drain you. She had brought her best self to Amsterdam, her art, her style, her kindness. And still, it wasn't enough to break through the wall of adoration surrounding her sister. It wasn't that she lacked value. It was that she was trying to find validation in a space unwilling to give it. Sometimes the problem is not who you are, but where you are seated. When the dinner ended, Sophie walked out into the cool night air. The canals reflected the glow of street lamps, the water rippling like broken glass. She hugged her coat tighter, whispering to herself that maybe things would change at the wedding. Maybe New York would offer her not just a chair at the edge, but a place at the table where she belonged. With that fragile hope, she boarded her flight home, unaware that the rehearsal night in Manhattan would test her in ways she never imagined. The rehearsal dinner was held in a Manhattan loft, its exposed brick walls glowing under strings of lanterns. Sophie arrived in a burgundy dress that gave her a flicker of confidence, carrying a carefully wrapped gift from Rachel's registry. She hoped that tonight would be a chance to feel included, a chance to show her sister that she cared. But as she stepped inside, Rachel was surrounded by bridesmaids, laughter spilling across the room. David's family mingled effortlessly. Her parents lifted champagne glasses, and Sophie found herself drifting toward the edge of the gathering. Her seat was at the far end of the table, next to a cousin who mispronounced her name and barely looked up from his phone. Sophie smiled politely, trying to spark conversation, but the noise at the center of the table drowned her out. Rachel's stories carried across the room full of excitement and applause. Sophie's voice, softer and slower, slipped between the cracks. She tried again, asking about Amsterdam, about the wedding theme, but the questions dissolved into the chatter. It was as if the closer she tried to move in, the more the evening pushed her out. Rehearsal dinners are meant to be warm and welcoming, a time to gather both families to laugh at old stories and toast to new beginnings. For Sophie, it was another lesson in invisibility. The way seating charts are drawn can sometimes mirror the quiet hierarchies of love. At the head table, Rachel was celebrated. At the far corner, Sophie was tolerated. She realized that it wasn't just the distance in feet, but the emotional gap between her and the rest of the family that cut the deepest. And no bouquet of lantern light could disguise it. Many people know this feeling all too well. You attend a family reunion, a company party, or even a church gathering, and discover you're sitting at the edge both literally and emotionally. It isn't about the chair itself. It's about what that placement represents. Being on the outside looking in can turn a celebration into a reminder of exclusion. Sophie wasn't resentful of Rachel's spotlight. What hurt was how little space was left for her own presence. It was a silent message: you are here, but you do not belong here fully. The lesson Sophie carried from that night was subtle but important. Recognition is not something you can beg for at someone else's table. It must be claimed within yourself first. She could not control where she was seated, but she could choose how to see herself. And yet hope still lingered. Perhaps tomorrow the wedding itself would be different. Perhaps under the stars of Manhattan with the city lights shining, Sophie would finally be offered not just a seat, but a place. With that thought, she left the loft, unaware that the rooftop ceremony would become the breaking point of her story. The Manhattan rooftop shimmered with white roses and the glow of city lights. Guests admired the skyline as a jazz band played softly in the background. Sophie wore a sapphire dress, one she had saved for months to buy, and carried an $800 espresso machine, wrapped with care. It wasn't just a gift, it was her way of saying, I am here, I matter. As the ceremony began, Rachel walked down the aisle, radiant and flawless. Sophie clapped with the rest, her heart swelling with hope that maybe the reception would finally bring her closer to the family table she longed for. But then came the seating chart. Names scrolled in elegant calligraphy filled the display, yet Sophie noticed hers, written in plain ink. Table 22. A waiter guided her past clusters of laughter and polished conversations to a corner near the service entrance. There a single folding chair waited, her name taped to the back beside stacks of plates and the constant shuffle of staff. Sophie froze, her cheeks burning. The sting wasn't in the metal of the chair, but in the message it carried in this celebration. Her place was disposable, temporary, an afterthought. Moments like this happen beyond weddings. Think of times you've been placed at the margins, at a work conference, at a holiday party, even in friendships where your presence felt like an obligation rather than a choice. It isn't the physical chair that hurts. It's the symbolic one. Sophie's folding chair whispered what years had already told her: she was welcome to show up, but not to be seen. Standing there, she realized the ache of invisibility had reached its peak. This was no longer just about her sister's wedding. It was about her entire place in the family's story. Rachel noticed her leaving and rushed across the terrace, her veil trailing behind her. Why are you leaving? It's my wedding, she said breathlessly, as though Sophie's quiet exit was the disruption. Sophie turned steady now, despite the storm inside. You showed me where I belong, she said softly. A folding chair by the service door. Rachel tried to explain: too many guests, too much stress, but excuses rang hollow. Sophie wasn't angry anymore. She was simply done. Years of being the shadow had condensed into this single moment, and she finally chose to walk away. The lesson Sophie carried from that rooftop was powerful. You cannot force belonging where you are not valued. Love and loyalty mean little when they erase your identity. Walking away wasn't about drama, it was about dignity. Many of us cling to places that repeatedly wound us, hoping they'll one day change. But the truth is, sometimes the most courageous act is stepping away. As Sophie disappeared into the New York night, her heart was heavy, yet for the first time it was also free. And soon, the aftermath of her decision would ripple far beyond that rooftop. When Sophie returned to her hotel room that night, her phone buzzed relentlessly. Dozens of missed calls, angry texts from her mother, sharp messages from her father. "You ruined Rachel's day. You need to apologize." It wasn't shock, it was repetition. For years, Sophie had been told to keep quiet, to let Rachel shine, to not make a scene. Now her attempt to stand her ground was painted as selfishness. It hurt, but it was also familiar. Families often preserve the image of harmony by silencing the one who dares to tell the truth. Sophie knew that role too well. The next morning, while her family gathered for brunch in New York, Sophie was already at the airport. She couldn't sit at another table pretending everything was fine. On the plane back to Chicago, she stared out the window, replaying the rooftop confrontation. Her sister's excuses, her mother's disapproval, her father's disappointment each echoed louder than the hum of the engines. Sophie realized this wasn't just about a chair at a wedding. It was about a lifetime of being placed on the edges. She asked herself a hard question. If I am always unseen here, why am I still fighting to belong? This experience is more common than many admit. In countless families, when conflict arises, the person who names the problem becomes the problem. Gaslighting is the quiet rewriting of someone's reality, convincing them their hurt is exaggerated or trivial. Sophie's family called her reaction overblown, yet none acknowledged the folding chair or the years of neglect it symbolized. If you've ever been told to just get over it when something cut you deeply, you understand Sophie's ache. Pain dismissed doesn't disappear, it multiplies. And it teaches us to doubt our own truth. In Chicago, Sophie returned to her art. She poured her grief onto the canvas, letting blues and oranges clash into storms of color. Each brushstroke became a release, a way of reclaiming her voice, without needing anyone's permission. Art, unlike people, didn't interrupt her, didn't minimize her. It reflected her pain honestly, and in doing so, offered healing. For the first time in weeks, she felt grounded. She understood that while she couldn't control her family's version of events, she could control her own. Her story didn't have to stay silent. It could live in her work. The lesson Sophie carried was liberating. You don't need permission to own your truth. Waiting for others to validate your feelings is a losing battle, especially when they benefit from keeping you quiet. True healing comes when you recognize your worth, independent of anyone else's approval. Sophie's decision to walk away was painful, but it was also a declaration: I refuse to be invisible any longer. And though she didn't know it yet, her choice to speak through art would soon spark a ripple far beyond her canvas, drawing attention from places she never expected. Weeks after the wedding, Sophie discovered her sister's Instagram post. Rachel, wrapped in soft filters and carefully chosen words, wrote a polished apology to the world. She called the seating mistake a trivial oversight and ended by saying, "I never thought Sophie would walk away over something so small." Thousands of likes poured in, comments of sympathy flooded for Rachel, while Sophie was painted as the unreasonable sister. Reading it, Sophie felt the old ache return, but this time it was mixed with something stronger: resolve. She knew her silence was allowing someone else to rewrite her truth. So one evening, Sophie opened her laptop and began to write. She typed slowly at first, but the words flowed faster as memories resurfaced. The Boston childhood filled with comparisons, the Amsterdam dinner where she was silenced, the folding chair in New York. She didn't write with bitterness, she wrote with clarity. She even posted a photo from the wedding, her name taped to the back of the folding chair, surrounded by dirty dishes near the service door. It wasn't about shaming Rachel. It was about finally showing the world what she had endured and why she chose to walk away. The blog spread quickly. Friends shared it, colleagues reposted it. Even strangers commented, "This hits hard. I've lived this too." Within days, Sophie received messages from people she had never met: siblings who felt overshadowed, employees who were overlooked, spouses who felt invisible in their own homes. The folding chair became a symbol far beyond her family. It represented every place where someone had been pushed to the margins. What Sophie thought was her private pain resonated with thousands, proving that invisibility is not an individual wound. It's a collective one. We often think that silence protects us, but in truth, silence protects the wrong story. By sharing her experience, Sophie took back control of her narrative. She wasn't the bitter sister or the dramatic guest. She was a woman who had endured years of neglect and finally chose to value herself. And in doing so, she gave permission for others to do the same. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Your story matters, but only if you're the one telling it. If you don't, someone else will, and they may twist it into something unrecognizable. Not long after Sophie received a package at her Chicago apartment. Inside was the espresso machine she had gifted Rachel, returned unopened with no note. It was a quiet reminder that reconciliation might still be far away. Yet Sophie no longer needed her sister's approval to feel whole. The world had seen her truth, and more importantly, she had seen herself clearly. What began as a painful memory had transformed into a platform, a movement, even a spark of healing for others. And as Sophie prepared for her first art exhibit, she realized the real ending to her story was still ahead. The night of Sophie's first art exhibit, the gallery was filled with a quiet hum of voices. At the center stood her most powerful painting, a single white folding chair against a storm of color titled The Unseen Chair. People stopped in front of it, some in silence, some wiping tears. One woman whispered, "This was me at my sister's graduation." Another man said, "This was me at my job for 10 years. Sophie listened, realizing her pain had become a mirror for others. What once felt like loneliness had now transformed into connection. Her journey had begun as the forgotten daughter in Boston, always compared to Rachel, always overshadowed. It carried her through Chicago, where she built a life, but still wrestled with invisibility. It followed her to Amsterdam, where her voice was drowned out at the dinner table, and to New York, where a folding chair by the service door crystallized decades of neglect. The aftermath was harsh, blame, silence, gaslighting, but it pushed her to reclaim her voice. By sharing her story, Sophie turned her wound into art, and her art into a language of healing for many. The lesson is one we all need to carry. Your worth is not defined by where others choose to seat you. You may be placed at the edge of the table, but that does not erase your value. The folding chair was never about furniture, it was about belonging. Sophie's story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful act is choosing not to sit where you're diminished, but to build your own table instead. And when you do, you'll find people who see you, hear you, and celebrate you for exactly who you are. Think back to your own life. Have you ever felt unseen at work, at home, or even among friends? Have you carried the quiet ache of being overlooked? Sophie's courage shows us that we are not alone, and that by naming our pain, we give others the courage to name theirs. You don't need permission to take your place in the world. You don't need validation to be real. You already are. And like Sophie, you too can turn shadows into light and invisibility into strength. If Sophie's story touched you, let it be more than just a moment of listening. Share your own experience in the comments below. Your voice might be the light someone else needs today. And if you want more stories like this, filled with honesty, resilience, and inspiration, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Together we can create a space where no one has to sit at the unseen chair again. Because everyone deserves a place at the table, and yes, that includes you.